In 1899, a Russian geologist and paleontologist named Alexander Karpinski published a monograph describing 6 fossils recovered from a quarry in the lower Permian rocks of the Ural Mountains, and every single one of them was, frankly, baffling. Not a skull. Not a jaw with recognizable teeth set in a row the way teeth are supposed to sit. A tight, near-perfect spiral of blade-like teeth, curling in on itself like a rolled-up tape measure, with smaller teeth at the center of the coil and progressively larger ones spiraling outward toward the rim. Karpinski named the animal Helicoprion bessonowi, and then spent a considerable chunk of the rest of his career trying to figure out one very basic question that most fossils don't usually leave you struggling with. Where exactly on this animal's body was this thing actually attached? He genuinely didn't know. And here's the part that makes this such a good story. Neither did anyone else for the next 114 years. Karpinski's own attempts to solve the puzzle are worth sitting with for a second, because they show just how little anyone had to work with. Fossils like this one, cartilaginous fish remains, come with an inherent problem, the same one that haunts every shark family fossil ever recovered. Cartilage doesn't fossilize the way bone does. It simply rots away, leaving behind only the hardest structures an animal was carrying, which for a cartilaginous fish usually means teeth and not much else. So Karpinski had a genuinely spectacular, genuinely strange spiral of teeth, and essentially nothing connecting it to the rest of an actual body. Working from that alone, over the following years he proposed, in turn, that the whorl might have sat curled at the top of the first dorsal fin, that it might have hung off the very tip of the tail, and that it might have projected from the end of the snout like some kind of built-in circular saw. 3 completely different animals, 3 completely different mental images, all built around the exact same fossil. By the same researcher, because the honest answer was that nobody had any better evidence to rule any of them out. That confusion didn't clear up quickly, and it didn't clear up cleanly either. Other paleontologists spent the first half of the 20th century proposing their own variations, and by around the middle of the century, something closer to a working consensus had finally settled in, that the whorl belonged somewhere in the vicinity of the lower jaw. That was progress, genuinely. It was also nowhere near the full answer, because knowing roughly where the whorl lived still left the actual configuration completely up for grabs. Did it protrude forward out of an open mouth like a rotary blade mounted on the front of a machine, most of it hanging outside the animal's own head? Was it tucked further back, mostly internal, with just the newest teeth exposed for use? Popular reconstructions throughout the 20th century tended to favor the most dramatic option, jutting whorls curling forward out of the mouth like something bolted onto a chainsaw, because that version made for a considerably better museum mural than a subtler, more internal arrangement would have. For most of a century, in other words, the best answer science actually had to give you, if you asked what Helicoprion looked like, was an illustrated guess. The fossil that finally settled the argument had actually been sitting in a museum collection for a while, before anyone had the right tool to read it properly. Catalogued as specimen IMNH 37899, held by the Idaho Museum of Natural History, it preserved something exceptionally rare for this kind of animal. Not just the tooth whorl itself, but a natural mineral cast of the surrounding jaw cartilage, the soft structure that almost never survives fossilization at all. In 2013, a research team led by paleontologist Leif Tapanila finally had access to CT scanning technology, sensitive enough to see through the surrounding rock and reconstruct that cartilage in full 3-dimensional detail, without having to physically cut into and potentially destroy an irreplaceable specimen to look inside it. What that scan revealed, published that year in the journal Biology Letters, ended 114 years of guessing in a single image. The tooth whorl wasn't perched on a fin. It wasn't hanging off a tail. It wasn't jutting forward off the tip of the snout like a buzzsaw bolted to the front of the animal's face. It occupied the entire mandibular arch, embedded and fused directly along the midline of the lower jaw itself, essentially forming the animal's whole lower jaw structure in place of a conventional row of teeth. And once researchers understood where it sat, the next question, how it actually worked, turned out to have an answer just as strange as the shape itself. In a typical shark, teeth are constantly being shed and replaced throughout the animal's life. Rows of backup teeth rotating forward to take over as older ones are lost, an endlessly resupplied conveyor belt, where the old inventory simply falls away and disappears. Helicoprion's jaw did something almost the opposite. The teeth were never shed at all. As new teeth erupted at the back of the jaw, the existing ones were pushed forward and around, curling into that same tight spiral rather than dropping out, meaning the whorl wasn't simply a display of teeth in current use. It was closer to a permanent growing record of every tooth the animal had ever produced across its entire lifetime, retained, coiled, and carried around in its own jaw. Tooth ring after tooth ring, not unlike counting growth rings in a tree, just built out of bone-hard tissue instead of wood. Once that structure and its function were finally understood, it also settled a second long-running argument about this animal, and it's one that had nothing to do with the shape of the fossil and everything to do with what kind of animal was actually carrying it around. For decades, popular reconstructions had defaulted to calling Helicoprion a shark, and honestly, it's an easy assumption to make. It's a big, ancient, tooth-whorled predator from a 270-million-year-old ocean, and shark is the most obvious mental shortcut most people reach for when they picture a cartilaginous fish that size. But the detailed cartilage reconstruction that came out of that same CT scan told a different story about where Helicoprion actually sits on the family tree. Rather than nesting among true sharks, the anatomy pointed toward a much closer relationship with chimaeras, sometimes called ratfish, a considerably less famous branch of cartilaginous fish still alive today, generally small, deep water, and about as far from a stereotypical shark's body plan as you can get, while still technically being a cartilaginous fish. The animal that spent a century getting reconstructed as some kind of nightmare shark with a buzzsaw bolted to its face turned out to be a distant, oversized, heavily armed relative of one of the most unassuming fish groups in the modern ocean. With the jaw's shape and mechanics finely mapped in 3 dimensions, researchers were also able to model how it would have actually moved and functioned as a feeding tool. And the picture that emerged ruled out one more popular old idea in the process. Earlier reconstructions had sometimes imagined the tooth whorl as a shell-cracking device, something built to grip and crush hard-shelled prey, the way certain modern predators specialize in breaking open armored food. The biomechanical modeling built from the CT data told a different story. The whorl's blade-like teeth and the rotating, slicing motion the jaw was actually capable of point toward a feeding strategy, built around a wide initial gape to engulf prey, followed by that whorl rotating backward through the mouth in a shearing, slicing action, a mechanism well-suited to grasping and cutting through soft-bodied prey rather than crushing armored shells. And that conclusion lines up closely with the direct physical evidence sitting on the teeth themselves, where patterns consistent with a diet built predominantly, and quite possibly almost exclusively, around soft-bodied animals like cephalopods, the ancient squid-like and ammonoid relatives that were genuinely abundant in Permian seas. Helicoprion, in other words, likely spent its life as a specialized soft prey hunter, its entire jaw built around one very specific hunting problem, and doing it with a weapon no other predator, before or since, has ever quite duplicated. Even with all of that settled, one part of this animal's story is still genuinely unresolved, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than pretending the mystery is fully closed. Typical size estimates for Helicoprion generally land in the 3 to 4 meter range, with confirmed larger individuals reaching around 7.5 meters, already a genuinely substantial predator by any standard. But a handful of more tantalizing, less certain specimens complicate even that number. A tooth whorl recovered from a Phosphoria Formation site in Idaho in 2011 has been estimated as belonging to an animal that could have reached closer to 10 meters, and an even larger whorl actually found back in the 1980s but not formally published until 2013 may represent an individual that exceeded 12 meters, comparable in scale to some of the largest living sharks today. Those upper estimates come with real uncertainty attached, built from fragmentary, extreme outlier specimens rather than confirmed complete skeletons, and they haven't been treated with the same confidence as the CT scan confirmed anatomy of the jaw itself. But they're sitting in the record regardless, a reminder that even after finally solving the century-old question of where this animal's teeth actually went, we still don't have a fully confident answer for exactly how big the biggest ones got. So here's where this one actually lands. An animal first described in 1899 from nothing but a spiral of teeth that its own discoverer spent years trying and failing to correctly attach to the rest of its body, guessing at a dorsal fin, then a tail tip, then a snout, none of them right. A rough consensus on the general neighborhood, the lower jaw, that took until roughly the mid-20th century to even settle on, still without knowing the actual configuration. And then, in 2013, a piece of technology built to look inside a human body, without cutting it open, turned on a 114-year-old fossil instead, and finally revealed the truth in one scan. Not a nightmare shark with a buzzsaw jaw jutting forward off its face. A close relative of the humble, modern ratfish, carrying its entire dental history coiled permanently inside a jaw built for one purpose, slicing soft-bodied prey out of a 270-million-year-old sea with a maximum size that, even now, nobody's entirely sure they've actually found the ceiling of yet. Alright, we've done a jellyfish that can undo its own death and a fish whose jaw took over a century to get right, so let's keep this rotation moving. Next time, we're heading somewhere considerably more recent and a lot closer to your own backyard for the real story behind the insect. The news spent an entire year calling a murder hornet and what it's actually capable of doing to a beehive versus what it's actually afraid of. That one's coming next. Let me know in the comments what else you want cataloged and subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for it.